Ladies and gentlemen, if you could come back into the auditorium and take your seats.
Yeah, I'll call them again, then I'll turn it over to you.
Our second panel of the day seeks to probe and explore some of the different options, strategy options and policy options in dealing with the entire Middle Eastern region, not just Iraq, not just Afghanistan, but the entire region. And so we've assembled a panel under Professor Bruce Kuniholm to get into that. So without further ado, let me turn it over to the director of the Sanford Institute, Bruce Kuniholm. Bruce?
The way we've structured and organized this panel is we have only 3 speakers. Scott, in his obsessive-compulsive way, was trying to insist that I have 4. But last year, there wasn't enough time for discussion with the audience. And so for a lot of reasons, I thought 3 was a better fit, and I think we have a nice mix here. As you know, there are profound differences among us about what has happened in the Middle East recently in the last few years and why, mostly in the Persian Gulf, although the Arab-Israeli issue is always there. And what we're trying to look at in this panel is what the options are for U.S. strategy and policy in the region. And I'm going to introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak, and I'll give you a little bio of each one and explain what that person's being asked to do. The first speaker on my left is Steve Grummon, who graduated from Cornell in 1969, served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Iran for a couple years, 1970 to 72, received a PhD from Johns Hopkins, and on the academic side, has been a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins and at Duke, where he taught for the Sanford Institute in Washington. He's been a scholar in residence at the Washington Institute, an international affairs fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a fellow at the Asia Society. He served in the U.S. government for many years, including the Office of Counterterrorism in the Department of State, the policy planning staff in the Department of State, and the National Security Council, where he served as the Director for Persian Gulf South Asian Affairs and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the Department of State, where he is currently the Director of the Office of Near East and South Asian Affairs and widely recognized as a top Middle East analyst. Throughout his career, Steve has received numerous awards recognizing his outstanding professional achievements, including 3 Senior Executive Service Performance Awards and several Superior Honor Awards from the Department of State. I've asked Steve to give us some sense of the regional context within which our other 2 panelists will have to grapple with what the future will look like. And Steve will go first. Each panelist has been asked to speak to 15 to 20 minutes if they need that much time. The next person on the end of this panel is Peter Feaver, who graduated summa cum laude from Lehigh University in 1983, received a master's degree from Harvard in '86, a PhD in political science in 1990 from Harvard, and has been at Duke since, first as an assistant professor, then an associate, and finally a full professor, and he's currently the Alexander F. Haymeyer Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at Duke and director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies. While at Duke, Peter has written a host of books and articles on civil-military relations, including Guarding the Guardians, Civilian Control of Nuclear Weapons in the United States, Soldiers and Civilians, the Civil-Military Gap in American National Security, Armed Servants, Agency Oversight and Civil-Military Relations, and most recently, Choosing Your Battles, American Civil-Military Relations and the Use of Force. While at Duke, he served as a United States Reserve officer. He currently is a lieutenant commander in the reserves, and from 1993 to 94, he also served as director for defense policy and arms control in the National Security Council staff. He is currently on leave from Duke and is serving as special advisor for strategic planning and institutional reform on the National Security Council staff. Peter will give us his perspective on what U.S. policy and strategy should be in the Middle East. And finally, Rand Beers, in the middle of these three, who graduated from Dartmouth College in 1964, served in the U.S. Marine Corps as a company commander in Vietnam, received his master's degree from the University of Michigan in 1970, and embarked on 35 years as a civil servant in 1971 when he joined the Foreign Service, subsequently transferring to the Civil Service in 1983. During most of his career, he served in the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs, where he wore many hats, including Deputy for Strategy and Director of the Office of Security Analysis and the Office of International Security Policy. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and on the NSC staff at the White House under 4 U.S. presidents, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. His functions included Director for Counterterrorism and Counter-Narcotics, Director for Peacekeeping, and Senior Director for Intelligence Programs. His final government position was as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Combating Terrorism on the NSC staff from 2002 to 2003. He also served as Deputy Political Advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. He resigned in protest from the NSC in March 2003, 5 days before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and retired in April. After leaving his NSC position, Beers joined the presidential campaign of John Kerry, serving as National Security Advisor to the Kerry Edwards campaign in 2004. Rand is currently president of the Coalition for American Leadership and Security, a national security communications organization, and an adjunct lecturer on terrorism at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where he teaches a seminar in collaboration with longtime friend and colleague Richard Clark on national security affairs. I guess you can imagine that he probably has an alternative view of what the future should look like, and we hope there'll be sufficient tension here to generate some good discussion within the panel and with the audience. So without further ado, Steve.
Thanks very much, Bruce. We decided we'd, on the panel here, operate from the table rather than going up to the podium. So, okay, I'll get a little bit closer. I just want to say I do appreciate the opportunity to be here, to share some thoughts and ideas with you. This is the second time I've done this, so I do appreciate being invited back, Bruce. I've been asked to focus on or to address what I guess you could call the operating environment within which these policy options or strategies will take place or unfold. In other words, what's the situation or the reality on the ground as we enter into or gradually transition into the next phase of modern Middle Eastern history? Now, I thought I would try to get at this topic by constructing two axes. One I will call a paradigm axis, and the second one I will call an issue axis. Now, let me turn first to the paradigm axis. And I should say, by the way, that I am off the record here. I'm speaking personally. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of State. This is my own personal thoughts as far as that goes. All right, so let me turn to the paradigm axis. The paradigm axis is really an attempt to understand what the theories are that are being articulated today about how the United States is going to interact with the region in the period ahead. Now, I've been able to identify two fairly stark formats or two fairly stark paradigms, although I think there probably are permutations and variations associated with each of these two themes. The first paradigm argues that the U.S. era in the Middle East is coming to an end, it's coming to a close. One can say, under this argument, the U.S. moment in the Middle East is coming to an end. Now, that's a paraphrase from a book written by a British scholar, Elizabeth Monroe, who wrote a book called Britain's Moment in the Middle East, 1914 to 1956, a moment which lasted slightly over 40 years. The basic argument is this. Following the end of the Cold War, the United States has had unparalleled and unprecedented influence in the region, as well as unprecedented freedom of action. This period contrasts, say, with the Cold War era, where the United States certainly had influence in the region, but its actions, excuse me, were constrained or I am really sorry here. Let me take some water. Yeah. Where U.S. actions were circumscribed by Soviet military power. Perhaps the classic example of all this being the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, where the U.S. in Soviet action and reaction put us all the way up to, what was it, DEFCON 3 or DEFCON 4? Yeah, I think that's right. All right, now it's true that the outcome of the 1973 war did open the door for very activist U.S. diplomacy. But the argument is that this all took place within this broader framework. The next era, that is the era of the U.S. moment, we would not have to operate in such a framework. Thus, in this moment, which started right after the end of the Cold War, so the argument goes, the U.S. was able to lead and fight the first Gulf War, preside over a decade of Arab-Israeli negotiations solely. We solely did that, and establish unprecedented on-the-ground military presence in and around the region. The argument then goes on to say, the reason this era is now come to a close is for the following reasons. First, the Second Gulf War, which has essentially crystallized anti-Americanism in the region, which makes it difficult for traditional allies and friends to work with us. It has created an anti-democratic backlash. It has reduced global U.S. power and has done nothing to advance the goals of the global war on terrorism. In fact, if anything, it's undermined them. The argument also says there's been some other factors which has brought this era to a close. The end of the Middle East peace process and the role of the U.S. as a balanced third-party negotiator, continued spread of radical Islam, mainly because the traditional Arab states can't stop it, and globalization, particularly in the realm of the information revolution. So that's the first paradigm that's out there. The second paradigm is really a restatement of the primacy argument as applied to the Middle East. In many respects, this argument takes the points advanced in the first paradigm and turns them on their head. For an example, just take one concept, the idea of command of the commons in and around the region, that is the oceans, the airspace, that kind of thing. We still have that, and Iraq's not going to change that. Or take a second measure, traditional friends and allies. The argument here is they're going to remain traditional friends and allies. They're not going to go away. They are going to be with us. They are not going to turn inward, and they are not going to turn away from us. The second paradigm essentially argues that the characterization which most clearly defined the U.S. moment in the region, that is, unprecedented influence and freedom of action, remain intact, should U.S. policy continue to see it in those terms. Now, those are the two broad paradigms, which in a sense try to capture where along the historic continuum the U.S. now stands. Washington, and really more broadly, the American people, are going to have to make some judgments about the validity of either one of these paradigms. But those judgments will not be made in a vacuum. They play straight into, and indeed are shaped by, developments, trends, realities on the ground in the region. And it's to those realities that I now want to turn. Let me start by observing that one way or another, we're going to move into the direction of what I would term the post-Iraq period. You know, we know when Iraq began, 2003. Historians are going to have to date when this new period starts. Maybe it's 2008, maybe it's 2010, I'm not sure. But willy-nilly and very slowly, we are moving into a new period of Middle Eastern history. And the question for us lies out there is, what are the issues which will be shaping those events and setting those parameters for us? Let me just tick them off kind of quickly, and we can go into more detail later. Let me start first. The emergence, not the emergence, but there will be two major regional powers out there. Israel is already there. Iran is emerging, but that's a story that's evolving, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But if you straight line out from here, Iran is clearly going to be a major regional power in the area. In the Arab world, there are several issues. First, Iraq. Irrespective of the outcome of what happens in Iraq, Iraq will emerge as a weakened state, unable to project power and certainly unable to balance Iran. Second, there are several internal tensions that are out there in the Arab world. We've heard about some of that already, sectarian and ethnic divides. We know about Iraq. Lebanon may be on the edge again of heading back into civil war. And there are other states that have these potential divides as well. Saudi Arabia comes to mind for an example, where you have both tribal tensions and again you have a Sunni-Shia tension. Third, there's tension over political reform and democratization in the region, that is between authoritarianism versus political reform issues. There is a certain, it seems to me, casual dismissal of the democratization programs in the region. They're not popular, goes the argument. This process is not going to go anywhere. I'm not so sure that's the case. It may take a different form, but I think that tension that's there between authoritarianism and democratization is still going to be in the region and is going to be with us for some time to come. Then, of course, there's the issue of terrorism and its relationship to political Islam. We've already talked a lot about that in the first panel. Just let me add one point. Again, it may be that in time, in a generation or two, that we're not going to talk about this issue the way we talk about it today. But in the period immediately ahead, it's again not going to go away. This is an important issue that's going to be there and be with us for some time to come, I would argue. Two other dimensions: oil and oil politics. Oil is back, energy politics are back in a big way. New players already on the scene, in particular China and India. And of course, there's the whole issue of proliferation, particularly nuclear proliferation in the region as well. That's just a checklist. There's probably other issues that I could have talked about, but I think that covers enough to point out that the United States is going to be operating in a very complex, and it seems to me a very dynamic environment in the period ahead. So at this point, I think I'll stop and we'll go on.
Well, it's good to be back at Duke. I feel like I'm slipping back into my traditional role, especially the way Bruce set it up. He described this as this was going to be back in a spectacle from ancient Rome where you've tied the wounded tether goat and the gladiator Maximus is going to have at me. We might disappoint you, actually, because there might be more overlap, although I don't know, we haven't coordinated.
Well, I mean, remember, we both served in Democratic and Republican
That's right.
administrations.
He was a colleague of mine in 93, 94, and I have a lot of respect for him. And so I hope we provide some interest, but we may not provide the blood spectacle you hope us to see. I should stress that I'm here speaking in my personal capacity. I'm not here as an official spokesman of the administration, and so I'll ask for your indulgence. I'm going to set forth my views, and if they're stupid or wrong, blame them on me and not on my boss. I'll begin with some thoughts on Iraq and then move to the broader Middle East strategy. But with Iraq, I think we're at a place now where we can see two possible futures, two courses of action that the current strategy, which has been labeled the New Way Forward, that the President announced on January 10th, that can proceed along one of two broad paths. The first path is we may find out over time that strategy is not working. That is to say, the near-term and medium-term goals that we're pursuing, we may not reach them, and the situation in Iraq could deteriorate. And if that happens, it will be time to pursue what is euphemistically called in Washington Plan B. Now, there are countless Plans B out there that are offered by pundits and think tanks, and when we were doing the Iraq strategy review in the fall of '06 that led to the New Way Forward, we looked at all of them, and indeed the New Way Forward that was announced was itself a Plan B, because it was a pretty dramatic alternative to the strategy we were pursuing through 2006. We looked at all of the Plans B. That was one of my jobs, actually, was reviewing them, and there are problems with all of them, and the best of the Plans B was the New Way Forward, which is the one that the President announced. But if that one, which is now Plan A, fails, then one of the other Plans B could become necessary. And it would be irresponsible of the government not to be doing quiet thinking and planning along those lines. But it would be equally irresponsible for me or anyone in government to talk about it publicly. Because talking about Plan B undermines Plan A. As long as Plan A has a chance of working, that should be our public focus. And that's all I'm going to say about Plan B. Remember, we're still in the inputs phase of Plan A. There's inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and we're still in the inputs phase. We have two of the 5 combat brigades on the ground in Baghdad. More troops will be coming, and the full complement will not be there until the end of June. We are expanding the PRTs, which are the civilian complement to the combat brigades. Those are being expanded now, and their full effect won't be felt for months. And the diplomatic surge that was part of the regional diplomatic surge that was part of the New Way Forward is just beginning to see fruit. We saw the first of the neighbors conferences. The next one is scheduled. The ICI, the International Compact for Iraq, which is the joint UN, Iraq, U.S. Effort to bring in the neighbors in a productive way to leverage their involvement in Iraq, that is just taking off now. So some of these inputs that are critical components of the new strategy are just coming in place. It'll take time for the outputs and the outcomes to be felt. And that's where leads to the second logically possible path, which is that, and I think the second path is actually the more intellectually challenging one, which is maybe why I've seen so very little written about it from a think tank in the academic world, but that is, what if Plan A starts to work? What do we do then? And let me be clear by what I'm laying by the predicate. The logical predicate of this thought experiment is by Plan A working, I mean that by late 2007, early 2008, we will have seen the following things: that the reinforcements sent to implement the Baghdad security plan arrive and are able to affect the security environment there. Not an absence of violence. I mean, we just saw it today, a horrible attack in the Green Zone, but there wouldn't be an absence of violence, but there would be a diminution sufficient to open up political space for progress on the political front. Likewise, under this thought experiment, there would be continued, if slow, progress on key political reconciliation benchmarks. The hydrocarbon law, some rejiggering of the de-Baathification, constitutional reform or amendments, and so forth. And then the Iraqi security forces continue to improve. The Army builds on its existing fairly strong foundation, and then the MOI and the National Police, which are lagging far behind, we actually begin to see some progress in those areas, those institutions as well. Now, that thought experiment, that's possible. It's by no means definite, and certainly no one in the White House responsible for policy in this area has any illusions about how hard it is to accomplish this, and especially in Iraq, how hard it is to make confident predictions about progress. There's a lot, the enemies of a free and peaceful Iraq are able to frustrate promising developments and are straining every nerve to do that, and we, as I said, we just saw that today. But this thought experiment is possible enough to warrant serious consideration. And if that happens, what then? What would be the right strategy to follow at that point? And we could, for sure, reduce the U.S. troop footprint if those conditions take hold, but we couldn't reduce it to zero. Even under that scenario, you would still need the embeds to bolster and train the Iraqi security forces. You would still need a substantial special operations force to do the high-end counterterrorism mission. We wouldn't imagine that AQI would be vanquished by that time frame, so there would still be a role for the high-end SOF. You would still need a substantial quick reaction force of some sort that would probably include ground troops to continue the coin operation, especially in Al-Anbar province out in the west. And of course, you would need a substantial logistics and combat support tail, since the ISF, the Iraqi security force, doesn't have indigenous capability there and won't for a while. That will take a longer time to develop. And what those numbers would be is anybody's guess. It's probably not less than half the numbers of where we will be at the height of the enforcement, but you know, some ballpark figure, 50 to 75,000, back of the envelope guess there, but something in that time frame probably will still be required. We would need a new legal framework for those troops, either an extended UN mandate, a new renewed UN mandate, or some kind of security agreement with Iraq, or both, some combination of that. And we would need a bipartisan consensus to support this longer-term U.S. presence, albeit a presence at dramatically lower force levels. And that consensus would have to survive the 2008 election and the arrival of a new president, including possibly a president from the Democratic Party. Now, none of what I just described would be easy, but the toughest could well be that last one. That is to say, a bipartisan consensus supporting a long-term presence. Because even in this optimistic scenario that I'm describing, there would still be people dying in Iraq. There would still be Americans dying in Iraq from IEDs and snipers. We would still be sending troops on a second or possibly third tour. There would still be dramatic terrorist attacks. And even if Plan A was generally working, even if in an academic sense we could say, yes, we're on that broad path, it's unreasonable to expect that everyone would agree that that's the path that we're on, that Plan A is working. That's just not how Washington works. There were expert voices that said we had failed in Iraq a couple days even, into the launch of the war in March 2003. And there'll be always voices that are preaching failure. So it'll take real political leadership on the part of the leaders of both parties to rebuild any kind of bipartisan support. And so the question is, could we get it? If history's any guide, it would be worth trying. As I read the history of the last 50 years, our national interest, and indeed global security more generally, has always been advanced when Americans have gotten past the bring all the troops home now war weariness and been able to maintain a longer-term global presence. And American national security interests and global stability generally have always been compromised when we haven't. This is true of the wars that we've unambiguously won. So there was a long-term presence needed in Europe and in Japan, in East Asia after World War II. There was a longer-term presence needed to stabilize the Gulf after Desert Storm, after the first Gulf War. It's also true of wars where the outcome was more ambiguous and indeed highly contentious in American domestic policy. So the Korean War, which was a bitterly partisan debate over the Korean War, and Eisenhower got elected on one plank, but he did not, in fact, bring home the troops from Korea. And they're still there, contributing to stability and security in Northeast Asia 50 years after the ceasefire. And in Bosnia and Kosovo, two other wars that were very, very contentious in domestic terms, they've required a decade's worth of troop deployments and are still the presence of international and U.S. forces is a factor for stability in those areas. And then it's true for wars where the outcome was decidedly negative. So the abandonment of Vietnam was a humanitarian disaster for the Vietnamese people. And of course the victims of the killing fields of Cambodia and the people of Laos. The very falling dominoes that the Vietnam War was supposed to prevent, I should say. And the abandonment of Vietnam enabled those dominoes to fall with catastrophic consequences for those people. Somalia remains a source of instability to this day. And our complete retreat from Europe after World War I didn't help, as students who've taken PS 93 know, because of the rise of Hitler and World War II. In other words, whether Iraq defies the pundits and turns out to be something like a victory, like whether it's World War II or Desert Storm or something, or if it runs more to what even optimistic pundits might say today and emerges as another Korea, let's say, one can make a strong case from history that a long-term presence would be desirable for U.S. national security interest and the broader global interest in stability in the region. And I'd be interested in hearing your views as to whether you think there would be a bipartisan awareness of these insights and whether such an awareness is possible in today's partisan climate. Enough about Iraq. Let me move now to the broader region. I actually see more of an emerging consensus supporting our de facto Middle East strategy, which is to say something sharply different from the caricature of our strategy that is available in countless blogs, op-eds, and even academic articles. But if you look at what our actual strategy is, how we write it in the 2006 National Security Strategy or as it unfolds, there's three broad pillars. The first pillar is a serious effort at nurturing the Palestinian-Israeli peace built on the foundations of the quartet principles. That is, recognizing the two-state solution, which President Bush was the first president to publicly articulate, but also recognizing that Israel needs a reliable partner for peace, for negotiations to succeed, and thus working with and trying to build up legitimate Palestinian leaders that want to be partners for peace, and pressing others, however they got into power, to endorse the quartet principles. It strikes me that approach, there's broad bipartisan support for it, de facto. Pillar two is doing the hard work of multilateral diplomacy so as to prevent the Iranian regime from acquiring nuclear weapons or imposing its will in Iraq, Lebanon, and elsewhere. That means not undercutting our EU3 and P5+1 allies and partners on the nuclear file, not trying to cut a separate deal, but working with them on a multilateral solution to Iran's nuclear ambitions. And then involving neighbors in appropriate multilateral diplomacy on Iraq, while countering efforts by Iran and Syria to sow instability there to advance their interests. And that's the Neighbors Conference I mentioned earlier. And then bolstering responsible states that oppose the revolutionary expansionism of the Iranian regime, while at the same time reaching out to the Iranian people to make it clear that they can have a bright future of cooperation with the United States if they abandon the regime's extremist agenda. One of the frustrating things of my job is being involved in public messaging that never gets heard. It's the metaphysical question of a tree falling in that no one has ever heard. But there was an important speech, or segment of an important segment of a speech that the President gave to the Coast Guard Academy in June of '06. And I doubt that anyone in this room, aside from me, has read it. But I encourage you to read it. And there's a section in there on directly addressing the Iranian people and making it clear that the United States, under this administration, views the potential for cooperation with the Iranian people and a bright future if the regime's extremist agenda can be changed. And then the third pillar is defending nascent democracies and promoting reform. And this means resisting the pressure that we've gotten from some quarters to throw the Lebanese people off the sled to the Syrian wolves in a desperate attempt to get Syria to cooperate on other issues. That is, it requires standing firm with the legitimate Senora government, and then patiently pushing the advance of effective democracies. The President's freedom agenda talks about effective democracies, that is, human liberty protected by effective democratic institutions, and patiently pushing that advance, not viewing elections as the only step, though it might sometimes be an early step. So none of this is easy. Nothing connected with the region is, as Stephen explained, except the one thing I've found that's easy is to caricature the President's policies, which is why I'm grateful to have the chance to come here and share my perspective of them. And I doubt that perspective gets much play. So I thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Peter, I'm really glad that you went first because I'm not going to differ with him very much on the broad strategy, just the details. But the details, I think, do make some differences. Let me start from a different perspective. And let me thank everybody here and Duke for sponsoring this conference. Let me say that I don't have to say that these remarks are only my own because I don't work for a U.S. government agency, but they obviously are only my own remarks. And I am also between two people who have access to classified material, which I no longer have access to, but maybe that's better. Classified material is, as those of us who've worked in the intelligence community, doesn't always mean anything more than that somebody put a big secret stamp on it. And it's not necessarily right or wrong. But I have to tell you that when I first left government, I was deathly afraid that not having the connection to classified material any longer meant that I was totally separated from reality. I've since come to understand that that's not necessarily the case. I want to start from the perspective of what are U.S. interests in the region, and then essentially go through a litany quite like Peter's and not very different in the overall strategic sense. I think that the United States has been interested in this particular region of the world in the latter half of the 20th century for two very important reasons and two very important things to prevent. The first is that we are obviously enormously dependent upon the oil resources that exist in this region. And if we aren't dependent upon it, the world is, and so it doesn't make any difference whether we're using that oil or somebody else is using that oil. The world economy is dependent upon this region. And secondly, from our own perspective, Israel is and will remain a steadfast friend and ally of the United States, and the United States is not prepared in any way to allow Israel to be overrun by forces who would favor the end of the state of Israel. The two things that we need to think about preventing, we've also talked about, and they are, first of all, the use of terrorism as an instrument directly against the United States or against our interests and our friends, and secondly, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the region and the potential for instability in the region that weapons of mass destruction would bring to that. Starting from that perspective and moving on to Iraq, I think that Peter has in fact laid out a reasonable set of ideas, and the only question or the only difference is have we already gotten to the point that Plan A has failed or never had a chance? Or are we going to wait? And how long are we going to wait to make that judgment? I would submit that while I would hope that Plan A would succeed, the evidence of the benchmarks that Peter has laid out don't suggest that those benchmarks are likely to be successful. We have talked and we have urged and we have pressed, and others have as well, for the succeeding in each of these benchmarks for some time. And yet the current government and its predecessor have not opened up the Constitution, although there's talk of it today, have not reduced the de-Baathification, have not come up with an oil law that ensures, to the extent that it could ever ensure, the possibility of access to revenue on the part of the Sunni population, which lies outside of Baghdad, predominantly in non-oil producing areas of Iraq. And so for me, the question really becomes, when do you make the decision to disengage? And having said disengage, I don't disagree with what Peter said, and I don't think if you read the Democratic proposals in both the House and the Senate, you will find much difference from the notion that there will be a residual presence. So Peter, on that note, absent some revolt of the people, I don't think that either party, whoever wins the 2008 election, is going to differ about some residual presence which will, one, continue to train and assist security forces but not participate in a direct combat role, and which will continue to try to have some counterterrorism capability should an al-Qaeda target be clearly enough identified and susceptible to some form of interdiction or attack, and that there will be a abiding presence for some military forces in Iraq to provide protection for the civilians that are going to remain in Iraq, and that there will be some need to continue to assist the Iraqi people on the economic side of the equation. The question, as I said, goes back really to the point of, at what point do you begin the withdrawal? And my own sense is that while the president obviously has the power and the authority to continue to prosecute the strategy that he is currently prosecuting, the longer there is a lack of success, and I think that really begins to be a decision point will be this fall. That is the original statement of the president's surge strategy, and that really will be the time when there will have to be some real evidence that not just a reduction in violence in Baghdad, but also some form of political movement in Iraq that suggests that the Iraqis who are governing at this point in time are in fact prepared to take some hard decisions that are necessary in order to achieve a broad-based Iraqi government rather than a more narrowly based government that we have at this particular time. With respect to the larger region, the Neighbors Conference, which the Iraq Study Group also suggested, I think is absolutely critical. I think that the engagement with others in trying to deal with Iranian proliferation is absolutely critical. And I think that a deeper involvement and engagement on the Middle East peace process is an absolutely essential ingredient. And I think we cannot walk away from our commitment to democracy in the region. But having said all of those things, now let me come back and go through and just say a couple of things about where I think there are important differences. The first I want to talk about is the administration's view that Iran and Syria are sufficiently engaged in attacking us that forms the basis for a limited or complete unwillingness to sit down and talk with either of those two governments, either in the context of Iraq or in the context of Iranian proliferation or in the context of Syrian support or at least acquiescence in the flow of international terrorists into Iraq or with respect to the peace process. I think, as the Iraq Study Group said, it's going to be absolutely necessary to find a way to have a dialogue with each of those two countries on the various issues with which we have significant differences. And I think if we don't move in that direction, the confrontational aspect of our relationship with both of those countries will persist. And to the extent that it persists, it makes it difficult for us, in fact, to be able to move forward. And lastly, so that we can in fact get to your questions, with respect to the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the neighboring states who are still not at peace with Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, I think that no one disagrees that we would like to move forward on that. It's not entirely clear to me that the administration's commitment to this particular process is also going to involve the long and the hard slog of engagement that I think has been the hallmark of moving forward. It is possible that it may not work in terms of who the partners on the ground are, as Peter quite correctly said. Who is Israel supposed to negotiate with? I think that's a very real question, but I think that it is also a very real possibility that working with Arab states, and I'm not disagreeing that the administration isn't trying to do that, may be able to create some basis for moving forward in negotiations, but I would want to take care in coming to public pronouncements about what is and what is not acceptable about what those Arab states are doing offers a way to engage them, I think, usefully in this process. And by that I mean the rejection on the part of the administration to at least some aspects of what the Saudis were proposing in terms of some form of engagement in the peace process. I think that these are all issues of diplomacy, these are all issues of tactics, but in the end, if you look at the history of grand strategies between administrations, they actually don't differ that much when you sit down and you read the national security strategy of the Clinton administration or the first Bush administration, which I think was the first administration that was required to write one, or the current Bush administration, because I think most experts see U.S. interests and U.S. challenges in fairly similar fashions. It simply comes down to what you actually end up having to do on the ground in a tactical and a day-to-day basis. So I think Peter was right in predicting we're not going to give you quite the gladiatorial combat that you might have expected, but I do think that
There's still time, right?
there are some real differences. Thank you.
Thanks. Before turning to the audience, I thought I might give each panelist a chance to respond to anything that any of the others said that struck them, that they thought they might have something useful to say. I'm sure that there'll be more opportunities as we engage in discussion, but any of you have anything you'd like to add?
I'll make 2 points that I agree with you that there will be this assessment process that will take place in the late fall. The challenge, though, is that right now, on day 68 or whatever of waiting for the sub to pass, is that the debate inside the Beltway, inside the hothouse that is the Beltway, is they're trying to legislate that answer right now on April 12th or whatever, mid-April, legislate an answer to that question rather than giving Petraeus a chance. And General Petraeus says he thinks that he's hopeful that Plan A will work, giving him a chance, giving him the flexibility, giving him the running room to see it through. And I think that's the debate. Not will we have to make assessments at the end of the year, but rather should we be codifying an answer, and should we be writing into legislation restrictions that hobble Plan A, and then sort of foreordained by law the answer. And on the engaging Iran and Syria, the Iraq study group recommended a neighbors conference of some sort, which is what we have done, and the administration has made it clear that they are going to talk to all of the neighbors in that conference, which would include Iran and Syria, about the situation inside Iraq, which is an area where we hope that we can find some modus vivendi that would be more helpful for Iraq than what we have seen over the last year. What Iran is doing inside Iraq right now is not helpful, but the Neighbors Conference is a way of exploring, is there ways to shift that. In terms of the nuclear file, it's important to recognize that Iran is trying to divide the united front it currently sees, where all of the P5+1 members of the Security Council are presenting a united front to Iran, saying you must live up to your legal obligations, you cannot be violating the law the way you appear to be doing. And Iran is trying desperately to cut and divide and peel off that united front. And bilateral negotiations on the nuclear file is one way that they seek to divide that. And we believe that the more effective diplomacy will come from a united front inside the UN, getting the UN Security Council resolution, which, frankly, some of us inside were wondering whether we'd be able to get. But the United States, with its partners, was able to get a UN Security Council resolution that has had an effect on Iran. And I think we've been able to do that by working with our allies, working multilaterally rather than falling into the Iranian trap of a bilateral file, in which case we're sitting there with no sticks and without the UN Security Council supporting us. And then on Syria, the challenge there with Syria is Lebanon. The legitimate government in Lebanon fears the bilateral deal cutting with Syria that would basically throw the Lebanese democracy off the sled. And that is why when Speaker Pelosi went to Damascus, that caused great consternation amongst our democratic allies inside Beirut, and that this is a real challenge for pursuing a separate path vis-a-vis Syria, is doing so in a way that doesn't abandon our democratic allies in Lebanon, who have, as you know, been victimized by Syria. But let me leave it there, and we'll take a question.
I would, Steve, you want to?
No, go ahead.
I wasn't going to have anything to say until you said something else.
I knew if I prodded long enough, we could get a fight.
The challenge for Democrats in Congress at this particular point in time, based on the Democratic Party's reading of the election results as a mandate to do something different with respect to Iraq, which I think is a reasonably fair reading of the election, was to then find some way to actually craft a response that was both responsive and responsible at the same time, and then had a majority, and those three aspects have, I think, been challenging in the Congress. And all I would say is, at this particular point in time, with no insider knowledge of where the conference report is going to come out, that it is more likely that the conference report on the issue of deadlines will come out with the deadline goal as opposed to firm deadline that was in the Senate resolution. Now, all of this is a lot of inside baseball in terms of Washington, and I'm sorry to say that I think that most of the American public, as Peter said, is still dealing with caricatures, which is that the president's course is stay the course, and that the changes that you illuminated, in fact, are not changes. And on the other hand, the Democratic Party is only interested in a cut-and-run strategy, which in their minds means the withdrawal of all American forces from Iraq, which is not what the Democratic Party is offering. But I think that the responsible part of the Senate resolution was to be constructively ambiguous about an actual withdrawal date, which would in fact both be responsive to the electorate, but in the end, if Petraeus and the current New Way Forward strategy was working, would allow some adaptation to that. Whether that in fact turns out to be the case is another matter. With respect to Iran, I wasn't actually suggesting bilateral negotiations with Iran, although I'm not opposed to them. I was really thinking about something that certainly came to my attention during the 2004 election, which was that the Europeans felt that the challenge of dealing with Iran in the non-proliferation negotiations was undermined by our unwillingness to be present with them in those negotiations. In other words, that the Iranians felt that they, in effect, would have to negotiate twice on this issue. They would have to negotiate with the Europeans first, and then if the Americans weren't happy with that deal, they would have to negotiate with the Americans if the Americans were even willing to negotiate. So on the non-proliferation question, I'm certainly in favor of pursuing the UN strategy, but I think we have to be prepared to show clearly by our presence at the table when Solana goes to Tehran that we're prepared to be there too, and that there's not going to be a second round of negotiations. And I think the Iranians at this point in time are sufficiently distrustful of us that sending Solana only and not making some form of a gesture that in fact this is this is representative and there won't have to be a second round, that we're ever going to get anywhere. And with respect to Syria, I'm really talking about negotiations with respect to the peace process and not undermining what's going on in Lebanon. We will always have to find that balance between dealing with governments and trying to promote democracy. But I don't think anybody in either party is intent upon doing that, and I think that Speaker Pelosi went to Damascus in order simply to show that Americans were prepared to talk directly with the Syrians when our embassy presence there has been diminished for so long, and other than at international conferences, we don't seem to find ourselves in the same room with Syrians.
Bruce, I do have something now to say. And it's a matter of now seeing if we can lift these negotiations off at some point, because I think you will find that we will be very active participants.
Maybe I could ask you, before we turn over to the floor, just one other question, Steve. We wouldn't want to ask you to prejudge, whether Petraeus will be successful or not, but one of the more interesting questions are, from your broad perspective and historical understanding of the region, what are the main challenges to his being able to succeed right now in Iraq? Is that something you could elaborate on?
Well, I think actually we've already we've covered this. Essentially, in one sense of the word, you can kind of sum up the whole situation with it saying you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And that translates into the following. I think we can bring about a certain modicum of stability in Iraq in the period ahead. I think that is possible, particularly in the Baghdad area. The second part then has to drop into place, and that's the Iraqis have to have the will to go forward, to use that political space that would be available to them to reach a certain set of very basic compromises among themselves. And the question, and we're testing that right now, is to whether ultimately the Iraqis, the Sunnis, the Shias, the Kurds, are prepared to make those necessary compromises so that something called Iraq can reemerge. Because that's really the question. Do the Iraqis actually believe in the concept of Iraq? That's what's hanging in balance. And you will get to those kind of answers to that question through the various kinds of issues that have been talked about: debathification, the oil bill, all of those kinds of things. So we're right now in a process of testing whether that second part, whether the horse is going to drink the water.
All right, well, thanks. Now we have about, 40 minutes or so for questions. So number one right there.
I'm still having a hard time.
Could I ask you to just say who you are, where you're from, or whatever?
I'm Steve Dicus from Vermont Law School. I'm still having a hard time understanding what's really new about the new way forward. Could you just explain very briefly how Plan A is different from the policy of the last 4 years? And second, what practical effect, if any, really, do you think the current debate in Congress over extension of funding might have on the prospects for success of Plan A?
Sure. I assume that's to me, but I can be truth squatted by either end of it. The previous strategy, which was depicted in the National Strategy for Victory in Iraq, which was a public, unclassified version of the classified KC campaign plan and the classified National Strategy for Supporting Iraq. Those were two classified documents that we then extracted and produced a public document called the National Strategy for Victory in Iraq, still available for download on the White House webpage. The core assumption behind that strategy, I mean, there are several, but one, in terms of your question, one of the core assumptions of that strategy was that political progress could precede security progress. That what we would do through a tempo of political milestones, first with drafting the Constitution, well, first with forming a constitutional drafting committee, then with drafting the Constitution, then with having a referendum on the Constitution, then with having an election, a national permanent, electing a permanent government under a passed Constitution. That political progress would have security consequences. Politics would precede security, because what would happen is a space would be provided for inside the Iraqi polity for Sunnis who were feeling who were feeling disempowered from the toppling of the Hussein regime, and that this political progress over time would siphon off support for the insurgency. The assumptions were that the key threats were a Sunni-based insurgency which had at its core Ba'athist, former regime elements that they themselves were probably irreconcilable. They would have to be killed, but they were kept alive, or they were swimming in a larger sea of Sunni rejectionists who were unhappy with the reversal in political fortune. But if they could see that a space for them there was a political space for them in the new Iraq, they would gradually join the Iraqi government. This would siphon support for the Sunni insurgency, and like all the long-term solution for all counterinsurgencies is creating this political space that would siphon off the support and leaving behind Al-Qaeda, which would have to still be fought, but we could eventually drive the Al-Qaeda threat down as we had built up the Iraqi security forces and gradually hand over that assignment. That was the old strategy. And what happened over 2006 was the political progress stalled. It took about 6 months to form a unity government, a permanent unity government. If you recall, the election was in December, but it wasn't until end of May that the full cabinet and unity government was sat. And so the political progress stalled, but also Al-Qaeda was able to trigger a level of reprisal, sectarian attack and counterattack and counter-reprisal with the Samarra bombing, which took a previously very low level of sectarian violence and drove it out beyond the capacity of the Iraqi security forces to handle. And the security challenge outpaced the political progress. So when we were thinking through the new strategy, one of the key assumptions we had to revisit is, could political progress still precede security progress? Or was there some minimum level of security, that population security for the Iraqi people, that had to be in place for them to stop the hedging behavior that would lead them to to arm militias and rely on militias rather than on the Iraqi government? And so there was the really dramatic change in the Iraqis in the strategy was reversing that and saying we have to have some minimum level of security, population security, before we can get the political progress that is needed that will then eventually produce the reconciliation that will resolve the security problem once and for all. So it was a reversal of that precedence, and that's why when we changed, that required a change in mission, because up until that point, the mission that Casey had been operating under was first and foremost training up the Iraqi security forces to handle a transition to Iraqi-led. And the president changed the mission, said you must provide population security in cooperation, work with the Iraqi security forces to provide population security. That's a different mission. So you go back to the military commanders, new mission, do a new troop to task ratio. They came back and said, we need more troops to do this new mission. And so it is very, those are some of the key differences. There's also at the, sort of more down in the weeds, less of a focus on the green zone. 2005, 2006 was very green zone centric. And the new strategy is pushing out and decentralizing, getting PRTs into embedded with, co-located with all of the combat battalions throughout the country, so there could be pursuing local political accommodations, recognizing that Iraq is something of a mosaic, and a political accommodation that might be signed in Baghdad might not have the writ, frankly, in Anbar or in the south, and so that you need to pursue local accommodations and thus have a much, spread the activity outside of the green zone. And then there are other pieces of it, but those are the main elements. And I forgot the second question, but I probably drove on to
Could you
them.
restate that second question about legislation?
Oh, how the legislation will affect it. What was undermining our strategy, I mean, there are many things undermining our strategy in 2006, but one of them was the hedging behavior by the Iraqis, who were making a calculation. If you're an average Iraqi citizen, you have to make the calculation, do I make a deal now that will get me killed if the Americans leave, or do I hedge against that? And as the sectarian violence escalated in 2006, we saw increasing hedging behavior, with Shia hedging by throwing their support for militias, armed militias that were outside of the Iraqi government, and the Sunnis doing the same. Not just support for al-Qaeda, but support for Sunni militias. And that hedging behavior is intensified if the Iraqis believe that they're just about to be abandoned by the international community in the United States. This is particularly strong. It plays particularly strong with the narratives that are dominant within the Shia community. The Shia narrative is a narrative of abandonment. And they were, in fact, abandoned by the United States in the early 90s, right after the first Gulf War, when there was an uprising and they were abandoned. That reinforced a Shia narrative of abandonment. So activity that we do that signals to them that we're about to abandon them, and that the war in Iraq is a failure and we are about to get out of Dodge, that reinforces that narrative, that pernicious narrative inside the Shia community, and similarly reinforces the pernicious narrative of the Sunni narrative, which is that we are the natural leaders of Iraq, and that in time we will restore our natural dominance over the rest of the Iraqis, and that once we can get the Americans out, we'll go back to it. And that is also a pernicious narrative that leads to the hedging behavior. And so some of the political posturing can very much have an effect on the calculations of not just the hardened enemies in Iraq, but also the broader population, the broader political forces, who we do need to be stepping up to the plate. And Rand is absolutely right. They were not. He could have been much tougher on us than he was. We expected that progress in 2006. That it's clear from the National Strategy for Victory in Iraq, which was published in November of 2005. It's clear we expected to see that political progress in 2006, hit those benchmarks. We didn't hit them. We didn't see that progress because this hedging behavior took over.
Okay, next question.
Hi, David Shanzer from the Sanford Institute. Say what you will about the way forward, at least it has a coherence, it has a story to be told, and you might say it's based on some rosy assumptions or it's unlikely to occur, but Rand, my difficulty with the Democratic position at the moment is that it seems to take the position that the project of building a Iraqi government as a unified Iraq has failed. And the sectarian civil war is inevitable. We can't influence that with our troops on the ground. We can't prevent that from happening. And we just have to begin withdrawing troops as soon as possible. And that may well be the most likely scenario, but I think if it is, you need to get to some of Peter's Plan B discussions because you're already at Plan B. And I guess my problem with the Democratic position is that it doesn't provide any answers to how we're going to deal with a potential sectarian war? How are we going to deal with potential genocide within Iraq? We base it on a rosy prediction that regional diplomacy will solve all that, with Iran and Syria taking a responsible role, and that doesn't seem to be a coherent answer. So I guess my question is, what is the democratic narrative about if Iraq seems to fail, well, how are we going to deal with all the negative consequences that are likely to transpire from that?
I think that the position that I was trying to expound on doesn't necessarily accept that Iraqis will be unable to come together in some fashion and solve their problems, but is more grounded in the notion that we have little ability to actually affect that, and that the slow form of bleeding that is going on in Iraq now, with our continued presence for an indefinite period of time, will continue to go on at that level. And while there is a possibility, and some will argue more and some will argue less, of an even greater bloodletting if American forces disengage. Remember, I'm not talking about leaving tomorrow. I'm talking about a process for U.S. combat forces to take 12 to 18 months in order to withdraw from street involvement in direct combat operations. And whether or not there is a possibility for outside powers to have any leverage on what goes on within Iraq, I think also is an unknown, but I think there's not a difference in terms of the administration being at least rhetorically prepared to engage in that process and what Democrats are saying. But your point, David, about the chaos, it's not clear to me that the choice between the form of chaos that exists in Iraq now and the unknown of what will happen if American forces begin to disengage over a deliberate period of time is going to be much different, and certainly it's not knowable at this particular point in time.
I agree, it is not knowable with certainty. However, there is an intelligence community judgment on this, which is available to you all because it was in the unclassified NIE. And the NIE is quite stark, quite dispositive on this question.
No. The NIE says the cut and run strategy. It does not talk about a deliberate disengagement. It was very clear that the options that were considered in the NIE were the caricature of the Democratic position and not the Democratic position.
Well, that's not how I read it, because
Listen, I was involved in this. I had something to do with that particular thing. No, it was focused on a total withdrawal.
over the terms of over the term of the NIE, which was 18 months.
Yeah, 18 months, yeah.
Yeah.
But it focused on what happens at the, in this period of time if we just pulled out. That judgment was pretty stark as far as
And I don't think Democrats would disagree with that. But that's not what the Democratic position is. So the point that the NIE speaks to is not what the debate is actually, or ought to be, about.
We looked at the proposal of a substantial disengagement from the cities, as you, that was one of the options that we looked at pretty closely when we were doing the Iraq strategy review. And the consequences of doing that was a spike in sectarian violence. That the intelligence community was pretty well agreed that in the short run that there would be a serious spike in sectarian violence, possibly order of magnitude increase in violence, so substantially higher. And then the question was, what would be the impact on the one national institution that was viable at that time inside Iraq, namely the Iraqi army? Could the Iraqi army, the Iraqi security force, What does history tell us happens to institutions like the Iraqi army in levels of sectarian violence that disengagement like that would happen? And the lessons of history said those security institutions crack. That is to say, it's very, very hard for an Iraqi army at the level that it was in the December 06 timeframe to withstand the levels of sectarian violence that a disengagement that is moving out of the cities into the thing would produce. Once the Iraqi security forces have cracked, could they be put back together in a reasonable time frame? We didn't think so. Moreover, the question was, what kind of pressure would that put on the U.S. military to be just 20 clicks away from sectarian violence of a truly horrendous scale, far, far in excess of what we were seeing even in the worst of the Ramadan phase of October, November? Could the U.S. forces stay there in garrison while the casualties were not hundreds a week, but thousands or possibly even tens of thousands, Rwanda scale, Darfur scale violence? Would the U.S. public allow the U.S. military to stay in proximity and do nothing? Or would that lead to a rapid collapse for any presence? And the president's calculation was that was too risky a strategy to move to in this time frame when there was an alternative, which was the Petraeus plan that we're seeing implemented now. As long as that plan had a reasonable prospects for success, as long as our military commander said, yes, we think that has a reasonable prospects for success, that was a less risky alternative than the one that you're describing in terms of engagement. As a plan B, if the other things fail, that's a different matter. But in terms of the options that we face right now, it's too risky to go that path. That was the calculation.
Anything more from the panel? Yes.
I'm Beth Berman, and I live here in Durham. And Dr. Feaver was talking about this thought experiment. And my question is twofold. What relationship do you see that thought experiment that you described as having to the ground reality that we're trying to get insight into? And secondly, you discussed in the context of the thought experiment, the inputs phase, and then the outputs phase and the outcomes. What provision does the experiment make for some kind of dynamic within these phases as opposed to just a static environment while we're adding the combat brigades and we're sending out more reconstruction teams, as if this input phase just lasted a certain time and then transferred immediately into the output phase? How do you have the back and forth that occurs every day?
Well, our calculation was that the enemy would counter-surge. And we've seen some of that. That is, there's been an increase in suicide attacks. So while sectarian violence has actually gone, this reprisal sectarian violence has gone down in the last 2 months, the suiciders have increased, and that was one of the plausible dialectics that we expected, that the enemy would try to counter-surge and sort of strangle the baby in the cradle before all of the reinforcements arrive, create a fait accompli of defeat, or the appearance of defeat. So very much aware that there would be this interactive effect. Likewise, one of the other concerns, and we're seeing some of that, is that as progress is made inside Baghdad, it squeezes to the Baghdad belt, or further out, say to Mosul, Kirkuk, other key cities and so part of why, part of what Petraeus has been doing has been increasing our presence in Diyala, which is in the Baghdad belt, precisely to deal with that sort of interactive effect. And these kinds of tactical tweaks and tactical innovations happens all the time in warfare. That's to be expected. That was assumed. That's frankly one of the reasons why we do not want to have restrictions codified by Congress in law, because that ties the hands of a commander who is in the best position to know how to adjust to evolving tactical situation, not politicians in Washington writing a law which is taking forever to get passed the first time. Imagine if the tactical situation evolves, how long will it take for them to rewrite the law to provide the kind of guidance that would allow for what would be the optimal response at that time. As to what we're seeing now is some early hopeful signs, but also some signs that it's way too soon to prejudge and say this is clearly going to be successful. I don't know anyone in the administration who has said that publicly or privately, but it's also too soon to declare that it's for sure going to be a failure. Certainly, we've heard that from folks outside the administration. That's not what we're hearing from the troops at all levels inside Iraq, but certainly that's not Petraeus' view. He says give it a chance. He believes it does have a chance to succeed. So that's how the thought experiment ties into the ground. We're seeing some hopeful signs. Some of the early tests, would the Iraqi security forces show up? They didn't show up in the first Baghdad security plan, which is why the first one didn't produce positive results. Would they show up? And there was debate inside the administration, inside the intelligence community about whether they would show up. They did show up. Would Maliki give a freer hand to the Iraqi security forces and to the coalition forces to enforce the law in a non-sectarian way, which did not happen in the second Baghdad security plan, which is one of the reasons why that one did not work. And there was debate inside the administration, inside the intelligence community, as to whether Maliki would do that. He has done that. And there have been far more operations against Shia militias than many people thought could have happened, with far less interference from Maliki than many people thought happened. So some of those key early tests have actually turned positive, or the early results have been positive. Way too soon to judge success. That's why the mantra is hopeful, but way too soon to judge the success.
How do you all judge the non-participation of the Mahdi army in this process? Are they just lying low and planning to come back, or are they, in fact, really in agreement with the whole process?
We asked the intelligence community that question, so
I was really asking Steve. I was not asking
you.
you, Peter. I know he's the one who has the answer.
In short, I think, for at least right now, they are standing down. They have not disbanded. They're standing down. I think in some cases, Sadr himself has not been all that upset with folks that have been rounded up, as far as that goes. But whether Sadr is yet ready to really play, as it were, and to disband, move in the direction of disbanding this force, remains to be seen. But for right now, it is a stand down, as far as one can tell.
And is there any indication that it's a stand down in the other direction, which is to simply let U.S. forces kill as many Sunni insurgents and terrorists as possible, so that the Mahdi army will be more powerful?
I mean,
having
that is a possible theory that is out there as far as that
goes.
goes.
I'm asking, is there any evidence of that? And I understand it's a theory.
Well, in terms of, I mean, if they're standing down, we're not going after them particularly. And so where you do have violence, and that has occurred in certain Sunni quarters, we've had to do more there. So you can make this argument that then says, oh yeah, we're in effect bleeding the Sunnis, and they'll, at some point, the Shia, in this case, Sadr, can come back at a later date. I mean, that is possible, as far as that goes.
Next question? Yeah.
Yes, Bob Gooten, just a local citizen. If we try to relate it to the broader question of terrorism, the question has been raised, is our involvement in Iraq actually resulting in the unintended consequence of more terrorists being recruited and educated throughout the world, perhaps, and whether that needs, so we've actually had the net result of making the world less safe rather than more safe.
Anybody want to answer that?
Steve, that's an intel question.
It's an intel, okay. You know, again, there's this argument that says that because we went into Iraq, you've created this enormous anti-Americanism, and this has been provided fertile ground for the recruitment of terrorists and all that. I mean, that may be right. I've never seen any statistics that I would put any faith in that allows me to make a judgment. Yes, but there were 300 of these guys in 2000, and 2003 there were 500, and now there's 1,000, or whatever numbers you want to use. I've never seen anything that allows us to quantify that in a way that could validate the thesis that you've just articulated. So in that sense, I can't tell you quantitatively that this has been the case. The argument certainly is out there, though, that because of what we've done in Iraq, this has provided fertile recruiting ground across the region and on into South Asia as far as that goes. But I can't give you any statistics that allow one to make a judgment that, yes, indeed, that thesis is correct.
The National Intelligence Estimate, though, the unclassified summary, does talk about that in one respect and says the gives the intelligence community's judgment of the consequences of leaving Iraq in failure.
That's right.
And it says that the consequences of sort of declaring Iraq lost and leaving, regardless of how many troops are remaining in Iraq, but the sort of the propaganda victory of having defeated the United States in Iraq, that the consequences of that for the terrorist movement broadly would be catastrophic and would be orders of magnitude worse. And now I'm extrapolating away from the precise language of the intelligence community, but would be orders of magnitude worse than the similar effect that happened with Somalia. You recall that bin Laden learned from the Somalia operation the lesson that the United States, this is what he learned from it, lesson that the United States was a paper tiger, and that you kill enough Americans, in the case of Black Hawk Down Day, it was 17, I believe, or 19, that then the United States would leave in defeat. And that bin Laden used that as part of his strategic rationale for his case. And there's a very interesting passage in our former colleague Richard Clark's memoirs about how bin Laden interpreted the Somalia episode. And I commend that to your attention if you haven't read that.
The NIE also says exactly the opposite of what Peter just said. It also says that one of the advantages that the terrorists draw from our presence in Iraq is that it is a recruiting tool, that it is an opportunity to shine a light on a non-Islamic occupier of an Islamic holy ground and other aspects of it. So, I mean, Peter, in fairness, it's glass half full, glass half empty on this issue. And one of the things that it certainly has meant, and I have resisted going back to the origins of the, or the initial period of the war, one of the things that it did do is by redirecting the bulk of our security effort into Iraq, the ability of bin Laden to regroup in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, wherever he was or is at this particular time, was allowed to occur. Now, I'm not saying he would have been captured or killed. No one can predict that, but there was a greater freedom of movement that I would have preferred that he wouldn't have had the opportunity to have, that was created by the U.S. entry into Iraq as we move forces and capabilities out of Afghanistan.
I might just add one brief comment on your question, and that is that in addition to the issues that we're talking about, ultimately we also made the Gulf safer for Iran, because between taking out the Taliban and taking out Saddam Hussein, and then promoting to some extent the rise of the Shiites in Iraq, this is an environment that's very conducive to Iran's ascendance, if you will, and it's made it much more difficult because of our lack of allies in the larger context to deal with the nuclearization of Iran. So there are a lot of complications in this whole thing that are difficult to address. Way up there?
I'm Warren Wickersham, one of the sponsors, and I think all of us would agree this has been a superb panel. I mean, with the background and experience that they each bring in the presentations. And as an aside, it suggests to me that one of the, probably the only good consequence if Plan A fails is that Peter Feaver would be brought back as one of the outstanding professors here on campus, might get one more.
I'll be frog marched off the compound.
But as a question, as a student of the Middle East, it strikes me that only passing reference was made to the big camel or elephant out there under the tent, and that is the Arab-Israeli situation or overarching problem. Would any of you care to comment on whether any even small progress in that regard over the next 18 months, 2 years, would have any impact on the broader issue, on the specific issue of Iraq, and is there any likelihood of that taking place?
Stephen, that's your...
I think I'll answer part of it, but I think part of it is to what extent the administration really wants to push on this. I think one of the biggest issues and problems we have now is, and it's already been alluded to, is on the Palestinian side, who do the Israelis talk to? And the Israelis have made it very clear there has to be a legitimate interlocutor. They're not going to enter into new negotiations without an interlocutor that clearly accepts the quartet principles. And right now, that negotiator is not there. It's not at the table. So I think that's a major issue. Secondly, I think the Israeli public coming out of the last several years is dug in very deeply about just how much it's really willing to give at this point. So there's certain very key framework issues that there's not even going to be any discussion on. And so how do the Palestinians respond and handle that? So in that sense, I think it's, there's a framework out there that's going to be difficult to move, at least in the period of time that you've outlined. I don't think that down the road that means there aren't possibilities, but in the period that you've outlined, the next 18 months, probably pretty hard to do anything really meaningful.
Well, no one gets rich betting in favor of progress on the Arab-Israeli dispute. That is a thorny problem that has lasted as long as our lifetime. There is one development over the past year that the Secretary has described a number of times, and that is on the positive side of the ledger in terms of your question. And I think you've ably summarized all of the things that are on the negative side of the ledger: reasons for doubt, reasons for skepticism, reasons for caveating. However, particularly as a result of the fighting in Lebanon last July, but even it preceded that, and that sort of crystallized it, was a view in the region that there was a serious problem in the region, a grave threat in the region. The name of that threat began with the letter I, but it wasn't Israel. It was Iran. And in the capitals our private discussions we would have with the leaders of the region, whereas before you might get the Arab-Israeli talking point first and foremost, what you got was the Iran talking point first. That there was a recognition that by giving the green light to Hezbollah to do what it did in last July and destabilizing the legitimate government in Lebanon, that this was a level of overreach on the part of the Iranian regime that seemed to crystallize a view in the region that there had to be a change. And that's what the Secretary was referring to. She talked about the new Middle East and the possibility for new horizons and new prospects. And that's the one positive thing that's on the ledger, that, or not the one, but that is one of the more important positive things on the side of the ledger that I think led Secretary Rice to push this initiative that she's been embarked on for the last several months that you've seen played out in the papers.
I might just go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's the hopeful possibility, and I fervently hope that it's the case. I think that the direction that this process is going to take and how soon it actually materializes is another question, is really from the outside in rather than the inside out, in the sense of the Saudis and the other states in the region creating hopefully some space with respect to how to deal with the Palestinian half of this negotiating team. If there can be enough flexibility in those discussions, then there is a possibility to move forward. And I don't mean just U.S. flexibility, I mean on both sides of those external discussions, to then move into the how to deal with the Palestinians. There is a possibility. There may just not be enough time left in this administration, regardless of what it wants to do, to actually accomplish those goals.
I might just add one further comment on that, and that is that if you look historically at administrations, the most progress that takes place is in the first couple of years of the administration, when there's also a learning curve. Of course, this is the second Bush administration, but the last 2 years of the administration are very difficult times for any administration to make progress, because it's such a complicated issue domestically and it requires such, at this stage, presidential involvement. If you look at what Jimmy Carter did or what Bill Clinton did, it takes that kind of investment when you even begin to get near final status issues. And there's always this trade-off of looking at process versus substance, but somewhere you've got to get down to substance, and that requires really serious pushing by the United States, which has serious domestic consequences because it's a very complicated issue. So I probably share the skepticism of many that there's going to be much progress on this issue. We have probably almost 2 minutes, 1 minute. Okay, one last question. Way up there.
Thank you. My name is Jerry Burke. I'm with the local United Nations Association. It's interesting in the tenor of the debate here, as it has been on a national level, Iraq is a place where the war is happening in, and the Iraqis are people to whom the war is happening. The use of the term with is a very rare commodity. In fact, Maliki's name really didn't come up until about 2 hours into the conversation. I'd like to just ask the extent to which, and this may be just ahead of some question of someone who's a woolly-headed proponent of the United Nations, to what extent have efforts been made, or are efforts being made to plan along with the Iraqi government?
Well, that is a critical component of the new way forward. I should have mentioned that when I was answering the question of what is the difference between this and the old way. One of the crucial differences is that the Baghdad component of the security plan was very much developed in concert by then MNFI commander General Casey and his Iraqi counterparts, and that it was a plan that had full Iraqi buy-in from the leadership, from the political leadership, but also from the military leadership inside Iraq, which was different from the previous two iterations. And that was viewed as a necessary, critical component for getting better cooperation from the Iraqi government. And so in the implementation phase, that they were very much involved in the design phase, and Prime Minister Maliki describes it very much as his plan, and he has played a key role in picking his leader to be the Iraqi general in charge of their part. U.S. forces are partnered with Iraqi units, and so there's a Iraqi brigade and a U.S. battalion partnered in each of the 9 districts, neighborhood districts of Baghdad. It's very much U.S. troops alongside Iraqi troops operating inside the neighborhoods. Is very, very much a partnership. Likewise, you mentioned the UN. The International Compact for Iraq is an Iraqi-led partnership with the UN and the United States, and then bringing in the neighbors. Is very much a partnership involving both the UN and the Iraqi leadership. That's the new phase that we're in Iraq. The days when we could dictate to the Iraqis what they would do and when they would do it and how, by what deadline they would meet this, that, and the other thing, those days, if they ever existed, those days are past. We have a sovereign Iraqi government that's been elected by 12 million voters voting in a relatively free and fair election for the region under a constitution that has been approved by a democratic process. It's an Iraqi sovereign government, and we are partnering with them in this fight. And that's, I apologize if that context didn't come through in my remarks, because it's very much at centermost to the way the administration views this.
Although, Peter, there is reporting that there was some degree of pressure and leveraging, and that there was some disagreement on Maliki's part, certainly in the early days. And by the same token, U.S. forces preserve Maliki in power at this particular point in time in the view of some people. So it's a delicate balance, and I'm not privy to the information you have. I have only what the press reports from outside.
I should say, unfortunately, the way forward to lunch is about to happen. So I'd like to thank our panelists.
Thank you, Bruce, for a very engaging panel. I guess we're losing lights here. Let me suggest that those of you who are joining us for lunch, that lunch will be in the Thomas Center, which is you go out the corridor here and go down to the right and take a right on